So, tonight we're going to talk about the first part of the history of Warhammer. Now, what makes Warhammer special is every single faction has its own take. There's no good guys. There's humans, but even the humans, I can't say if they're the good guys or not. There's certainly a lot of bad guys, and so if you ever want to get into 40K, I would just consider looking at the artwork and seeing if anything clicks and exploring that venue. The first thing I ever saw 40K was when I went to Hobbytown, USA with my dad when I was in 5th grade. I saw the cover of the Tau Codex. And these guys, they had suits and laser guns and suits, and they had alien mercenary comrade. It was so incredible. And so that's how I got started. Maybe you'll get into it that way. To be honest, now is really not the time to start. The best time to start was about 10 years ago. And so, you've got this pretty common trope between most science fiction, space, whatevers, all right? And that is hyperspace, hyper jump, the quick, the faster than light thing, okay? And so Star Wars and Star Trek kind of handle it really tamely. It's just like a worm. I mean, it's not okay. I guess they actually have wormholes, but it's just like a path from point A to point B, and that's cool. But in 40K, this is actually a very tangible realm, and the thing about that is it's where our thoughts go. It's where every sentient being's thoughts dwell as soon as we think of them. And the warp is kind of like a sea. It's kind of like an endless sea that the emotions kind of pool around. And with that, just like in the actual sea, you're going to have driftwood coming together and eventually coalescing into islands. It happens with garbage, driftwood all the time. And the first sort of emotions for this to happen, the most common emotion that was felt through generations of races rising and falling would be anger. The need to make war. I mean, this is Warhammer, and so this is it's an innately it's kind of twisted up, very nice in Stanley Kubrick's 2001 with the monolith and then the chimps and that's kind of what sets the tone for everything here. And there are some other gods. The one that is mostly opposed to Khorne would be Tzeentch. Khorne is the god of martial prowess and anger, and Tzeentch is more of the god of trickery and lies. Next, we have Nurgle. And 3 gods, all right? But the warp exists in a non-linear plane. There's actually 4 gods in the warp. There's more. There's 5. But for the purposes of the main warp gods, we're gonna be looking at around 4, all right? And by the end of this, you're gonna figure out why there is and isn't a 4th god at the beginning of where our tale takes off. So basically, the first great galactic civilization would be the Old Ones. They're your classic forerunner kind of race. They're very technologically advanced. While spoiling a little mystery for you, popping that balloon because it's always interesting to just wonder what they looked like. In Halo, the great reveal was the Forerunners were us, the Reclaimers. They look like fat giant lizards, but they were really benevolent. They were very capable of engineering. They got to the point where they could actually engineer races to do tasks for them. And even though they had this very sort of tyrannical view over these races that they created, they were willing to spread their influence across the stars benevolently by connecting with every galactic or spacefaring civilization or non-spacefaring civilization. So you kind of have a unified galaxy in which everyone's more or less getting along. And now we get to the Necrontyr. The Necrontyr might resemble you or I. I think might be a little squatter, maybe a little smaller. And they're going to live roughly about half as long as any of us would live, because their life cycle is hideously crippled by their sun. You see, they're orbiting a star, and in that orbit, they're receiving cancerous rays from that star. And so this has just kind of been like a way of life for them, something that they just accepted. And the old ones come across the Necrontyr, and despite, I believe, their earliest assessments, they give the Necrontyr the ability to take to the stars. And so the Necrontyr immediately abuse this, and they end up going to war with the old ones. Now you can imagine how it would end up. You know, the most advanced, powerful galactic civilization going to war against one planet. You can imagine how that would turn out. And so the Necrontyr were sent back to their planet of Necrontyr, I guess. Maybe that's what it was called. I don't know. And they used the technology that they had hoarded from the old ones, because the old ones removed their ability to leave the planet. They didn't ever want another catastrophe like that. But they were foolishly benevolent, and they allowed the Necrontyr to survive. They did not genocide the Necrontyr, even though they could have. And so the Necrontyr were really pissed about the whole thing. All right, they had plans for some reason, I think, a galactic dominion, or you know, it's from such a vague time in the timeline that there could have been some sort of disagreement between the two that would start their conflict, but that doesn't seem too probable, as the old ones kind of just, you know, left them behind. But so they started checking out their star, their home star, and believe it or not, there's an organism orbiting the star within its corona, its nebulous corona shadow. And with that, they were noticing that the creature was feasting off the star. So a bunch of scientific minutia. Basically, this creature feeding off the star was making them all suffer through those cancerous rays. And so they figure out some way to lure the creature to their planet, or close enough to their planet. And through a series of events that have been changed and shaped through the lore, so that what I'm saying here now might be controversial in some circles, is that they gave this star creature, they gave this creature that was feeding on the star a metal body, a corporal form, because it was essentially floating around kind of like rampant energy. And these star gods had a name, the Catan. Now, I had mentioned chaos gods earlier. I mentioned the Catan, and not quite on the same power level. I think the Catan are just about as powerful as you can become without being a god, but they're not quite gods. They're they're like energy beings. So I guess they're somewhere between godlike and demigod, if there ever was some sort of need to further split the hair with the demigod. Yeah, they could be demigods. And so with these demigods, the Catan, the Necrontyr, well, they did it again. They used the Catan to create weapons and ships, and they kind of used the Catan to power themselves, their fleet. And with this sun no longer being predated upon, they were able to spread across the stars rapidly. And with this rapid life cycle that goes through over and over again, they were easily able to have the numbers to face the old ones. The old ones were not that numerous themselves. They did not value that sort of widespread breeding, I guess. And in order to stop the advance of the onslaught of the Catan and the Necrontyr, the old ones actually created a couple races. I know they had some proto races, but eventually these things end up becoming the Eldar and the Orks that we know today. And they were basically, I'm not sure the process of maybe if they were spliced together from several different things, or if they were taken from the old ones themselves. So that doesn't seem too likely, as they don't really they don't resemble the old ones in any way. They don't look like the Slann, which are those guys that sit on those toes that sit on those hover things. And so there's a war. It's called the War in Heaven, and I'm actually a little shaky on the exact details, but it does not go well for the old ones. It goes particularly bad. And at the end of this war, there's this thing called the Destroyer Plague. And it goes throughout the entirety of the Old One's empire. And it's a terrible thing. A terrible, terrible thing. It can't be, the Necrontyr can't stop it, the Catan can't stop it, the Old Ones can't stop it. So, meanwhile, the Catan have realized that it feels incredible to be worshipped. It feels like magic, and they almost feel as if their power is increasing with the amount of those that worship them. And they convince their subjects. They tell them, we can survive the enslaver plague. We can do this, but you'll have to give up your forms. Just as you gave to me a metal body, I will give to each of you a metal form. And so the Necrontyr shed their mortal forms, but in the process lost most of their functioning, their mental capacity. Only the hierarchs, only those at the upper tiers of the Necrontyr society were able to retain any sort of logic, or, well, not logic, but emotion or personality. And they go into a deep sleep in each of their worlds that they have taken root over. They enter a deep sleep, and they are not seen ever again. The old ones, maybe they're wiped out by the warp plague. Maybe they transcended into energy beings, or maybe they just are in hiding. They just decided that it was too much. They would rather live a utopian lifestyle than try to hold the galaxy together. Who knows? Now, the Orks and the Eldar were basically the only ones left to pick up the pieces. Orks are a very interesting, I think, take on it. If you're just going to use your stereotypical idea of what an orc is, I think you're going to get 98% of the way there. These guys, though, are kind of special. They are plants. They are plant-based life forms. They still bleed red because that looks cool. But they're actually fungus, and so if you destroy one or a couple, you blow them to pieces, you're going to be spreading orcish spores somewhere or on the battlefield. And so bring your flamers, cook it all away. But orcs will mass like this to this way that they not so much reproduce but replicate. And the other 1% that it's really important to know about the orcs is they are all low-level psychers. There's not a single orc out there, maybe even this could be said for the Gretchen, that doesn't have some sort of innate pull with the warp, and it's kind of just a sense of mind over matter. If it's red, it goes faster, and it actually does go faster. Deathcopters can fly. Yeah, Deathcopters can fly. If you look at them, there's no way. I mean, I feel like there'd probably be enough thrust to get the Ork off the ground, but to actually be able to control this thing in a method that wasn't akin to just firing a rocket off into the atmosphere, it leaves a lot to be believed. But the main power that the Orks do enjoy is the power of the Wog. And with the Wog, they can basically rally. It's like a super duper rally ability. It gets Orks coming in from all over the place. And I guess here's a bonus 1%. Orks are a lot like me. They have terrible posture. But just like me as well, every time they take damage, every time they heal, every time they get scar tissues, they actually end up becoming stronger, standing up taller, and eventually they can become a knob, which is a translation of noble. Kind of weird. But the biggest, baddest Orks are going to be the ones that have taken the most damage, not necessarily done the most damage. And it's the biggest, baddest Orks that lead the pack. They kind of have a philosophy that I can't argue with. The Orks, they say, Umis don't know who's in charge. They're always fighting over who's in charge. But Orks know the biggest is in charge. And that, there's a poetic simplicity there at play. That's enough about the Orks. Oh, they have their own gods, Gork and Mork, and I've spent many hours thinking about if there's a difference between cunning violence and violent cunning. I've spent so long, way too long, probably longer than the devs ever did. And I can tell you my thoughts are inconclusive. So the Orks are strong-holding massive amounts of territory across the galaxy. And they can't be stopped. The Eldar, even though they were both created by the old ones, they are not aligned without the old ones there to keep them in check. And because of this, they are at war. They are at just hideous war. And so there's Orkish enclaves, but eventually the Eldar discover their heritage. They discover the Webway, which is an incredible technology. Basically, instead of ripping a hole in reality to go through the warp and then come out the other side, they had the Webway, which are just like teleportation portals. And I mean, I guess it's essentially you're trading your 40K FTL for Star Wars FTL at that point. But it's an incredibly important thing because you don't have to risk going to the warp. Why would you do that if you didn't have to? And so they use this Webway network to basically create not only the second most notable empire on record that we have at this point, but they also create the Webway network, which is Kama Ra, and it's kind of like another dimension. It's so there's reality, there's the warp, and then somewhere in between there's the Webway. And so through this technology, the Eldar basically overcome everything. They get to the edge of the galaxy, they look at the void, and the void stares back at them. So they did it. I mean, they got as strong as they could. They got as fast as they could. They just kept on doing all these things, but they had no challenge. They had reached the end of the challenge point. So it just so happens that they became heathens. They became quite hedonistic. And their worship of hedonism created a new god named Slannesh. Now, Slannesh does and does not simultaneously exist with the rest of the gods in the warp. So there's a rivalry, and Slanesh's birth is the death cry of Eldar civilization. They basically gone in a couple of seconds as all of their souls are consumed to subsume this, really just their entire empire. There were some Amish Eldar or some Eldar pilgrims or whatever you want to call them, called the Craft World Eldar, and they fled. They fled society with their craft worlds, which they live on. So it's like a massive dome ship. They've got soul stones, which are cool because when they die, their soul will just get stuck in the stone. So they can still pilot ships and talk to people and pilot battle suits and do things like that. The only thing is if their soul stones ever found, can be consumed by Slannesh. So they kind of, the Space Puritans kind of made away from the Dark Eldar. And I think that's about it. This is just interesting for getting to know a couple of the most notable Xenos races, the Necrons, the Orks, and the Eldar. And it's important to also know about the powers of the warp. It's a constant power struggle. It's a constant power struggle. Okay.